Hello, it's Friday, and I just got into the studio and I'm reading the comments of the video about monorepos that I posted this morning. Like, you can find it there, card. In case you don't want to watch the whole video, I talk about how monorepos gives you an increased ability to share code between your teams and developers. Over separating code out in different repositories and sharing them through NPM modules, and how NPM modules, while they do have a certain benefit, they also make it a lot harder to make sweeping changes across your system, because it's a lot harder to see what code depends on which NPM modules and how, and they're spread across different repos. And I got one follow-up question that kind of like got me really, it was really good, and I wanted to address it. It's by Rooftop Duvet, and he says, what are your thoughts on monorepos versus team skill level? I imagine that Spotify has a wealth of talented developers who have the awareness to properly inspect what code their changes are going to affect and test pipelines to catch bugs. Maybe I'm wrong. But what about a startup which can't afford to hire the best yet, or hasn't instilled a sense of group ownership in its employees effectively, or that doesn't have a huge number of build tools? Won't separate repos be an appropriate trade-off here, or are you always pro mono? So this is a really interesting question, because this is not just Rooftop Duvet. I hear this all the time, and I see this I saw this happening at Spotify, and I saw this happen. I see this happen when I talk to friends of mine who are in organizations that are growing a little bit, and there is in software there's always a problem with ownership and alignment. As your development team grows, you're going to have more and more like people like interacting with each other, and it's going to be more and more tricky for people to feel an ownership around your product, and like getting people to know the holistic view of the system and interact in productive ways. You might end up with parts of the system like there is perhaps like John is the maintainer of this little piece of code, and nobody really knows how that code works. John is also a little bit difficult, so it makes a lot of sense to just keep that code over there and let John do that. And if we need to change some functionality in that code, maybe then I have to talk to John, or maybe I have to go into that code that John has written and I don't really understand, and it's better if John just either does his thing over there and we open up a issue in his repo and talk to his manager and see if we can get his team to do changes on it, or we just that seems like a lot of work, maybe we just go and actually let's just write our own module instead of using that one. It's actually better, because our use case is not quite the same as theirs, so we shouldn't use that component. No, yeah, it's a scroll component, but our scroll is different. We're gonna build our own scroll component. Let's do that. That's way easier. Also, then we don't have a dependency on that team. Then we can do our own thing. That's the kind of thing that starts happening. And this is... The thing is, you're not really solving a problem by separating things out when you have this problem. If you have a problem when your developers are not interacting properly, and when they're not when teams are not quite aligned, and when libraries are not aligned with the general needs of the company, that you perhaps see multiple scroll libraries happening. Instead, when it's obvious that they could be shared, it's just that developers have been not good enough at figuring out what the general use case is. The library authors haven't been looking down enough, and the consumers haven't been looking up enough, or there's just not, the collaboration is not happening. The shared ownership is not happening. like people are siloing themselves off in little parts of the code, like me, my code, my code, my code. And when this starts to happen, there is a huge temptation to kind of go further down that road. Like, okay, like, let's break that off into a separate repo. Let's break that off into separate modules, separate NPM module. Let's break that off into a separate team. Let's completely like isolate this problem. We're not talking properly, but perhaps that's actually a feature. If we can like build a little wall or like a little box this conflict, this communication conflict into like a little box, and then only talk to the box through a very separate, like very small set of parameters, then we've solved the problem. But the truth is that you haven't really. You have just like put you've just created like a ocular illusion that makes it feel like you've solved the problem. It's a little bit how people think that it's separation of concerns to put like CSS, HTML, and JavaScript into separate files. No, not really. You have just separated your concern out over different places. But because things visually look like they are like in neat little places, it looks like you've solved the problem. And the same way when you have like shoved your scroll component into like this separate NPM module, it seems like you have solved the problem. To be clear here, I'm not saying that breaking things out into separate modules or like shared components like NPM modules is bad. It's a great tool and might very well be appropriate. However, you need what I'm saying with this in this video is that it's very important to know why you're doing it, so that you're not doing it because of like an underlying communication problem, because you need to solve that first. If you don't have a sense of ownership, shared sense of ownership in your system, do for the love of God not try to solve that by distributing ownership. So let's say that you have this problem of that your development teams are not quite aligned, and it's hard for your people to see how changes put together, because like you don't quite know that code, and you don't like, it's hard for you to make sweeping changes, and then you break things out into these modules. The assumption in this question is that it becomes easier when you break things out into separate modules, but it doesn't. Like, it actually becomes a lot harder, because if you have like one big code base, it's just naturally easier through the tooling that is available, like code analysis and stuff like that, to just find how dependencies interact. And it's also easier to see how to make one big change that affects multiple modules. Like if you have one big repo, you can make one pull request, and people that like are familiar with all pieces of code can go in and help you out on that thing. If you have a separate repo over there and make a pull request over there, like the authors that depend on that shared library code are not, they might not even be notified because of how the system works. But you might also be like, because of the power of the NPM versioning system, perhaps you're making a breaking change. Let's say you're making a breaking change, and you're adding like a method or something that your code uses. And since it's a breaking change, you just update the major, and then you kind of like the problem that other people will have to update their code against your change and test their code against your change. You kind of like shove that away into like, yeah, it's okay, because I've clearly said that this is a breaking change, is an update, and that's fine, you know. So you kind of like this decoupling of NPM versions and the fact that you can update a shared component and have your little app just update that, and then other apps that depend on this code, they just remain on the old version, right? And no problem, they can do that. Then they can update that in your own time. But like, what you need to be aware of is that it's a huge problem when your code goes stale and it's not in sync with all dependencies, even in like internal dependencies, internal shared libraries. And like, if you don't believe this, just remember how difficult it is when you have an app that depends on an old version of jQuery or like an old version of React, and that hasn't been like developed in sync and updated, how difficult that application is to deal with. A very important aspect of application health is that you keep your applications, your application dependencies up to date. So when you are like changing a shared dependency, you're kind of like, without like also going into your shared code base and fixing and testing all the code that depends on these dependencies, you're adding a lot of work for a lot of other people. And if you're just like updating the major and not thinking like about like testing the actual places where it's used, you're creating a lot of work for other people, and you don't know how much that work is. Like you actually don't even know if the change that you're making is appropriate for like the holistic use of the thing. Perhaps like if you add that thing and set that as a pull request for the entire organization to see your entire like code base, all the applications that depend on the thing. If everybody got to comment on that pull request, perhaps you've gotten the comment that this doesn't really fit at all into this shared library, because like, it just doesn't sync with how most applications are using it. You should probably break this off into like a separate module for just your code. Adding this code here would just add a lot of work for the entire organization, but it was really only beneficial to your app. And we found that this was often the case at Spotify. When we moved to a monorepo, people started making changes much more responsibly. Because if you are the person that actually have to, like, when you make a pull request and change the library, then you're the person that actually has to go through all the places where the library is used and update them. You get a much better understanding of your change and how that adds value or like maybe removes value or like makes things more difficult for other parts of the code, and the amount of changes it needs to make. I think it's very important to understand that shared code, when you change it, it has to be updated. It has to be tested and updated, or like all the code that uses it will have to be tested and updated. And if you're shoving things up in separate repos and like walling that off into their own clean little boxes, you're losing your connection with that work, and you have no idea how much work you're putting on the rest of the organization. And you're also like losing touch with the holistics of the system. And if I'm being like perfectly honest, I think that this kind of problem comes a little bit from the fact that people don't want to talk to other people. Developers don't want to avoid like having conflicts and discussions with other people. And I think that this is the thing that people have in general. Of course, like it's not fun to have conflicts. It's just like you just want to do your work. You don't want to like go to another team and sync with them. How should we change this library? That's nasty, you know. Like that's just a distraction. But I think that developers in particular, the software development industry in particular, is a little bit worse, because we have for a long time been hiring these lone wolf geniuses. There's like this Alan Turing stereotype where like that as long as you're a bloody genius, it's okay if you don't know how to talk to people. Which is absolutely ludicrous, because development unless you're developing like an indie game or something where you are the only developer, or if you're, I don't know, developing some little art project or something, like unless you're doing that, software development is comprised of these huge teams that need to collaborate and figure out solutions in order to build a cohesive software product. Software development is like, it requires so much collaboration, and talking to other developers like that overlap, and talking to product owners as well and other stakeholders. That is actually nowadays, at least in my experience, a bigger part of the job than coding. And so it makes, like, sometimes I'm just baffled by the fact that I just find myself in software organizations where there's a person that is hired and they lack absolute basic communication skills. They have no idea how to solve a conflict. They have no idea how to initiate a conflict. They don't bring things up. And I just like, how was this person hired? How could they not have checked for this? Like, you could have like sorted this out in just like having like a basic conversation with the person and see if they challenge you on it. Like, it's nuts. But we just don't interview for that. We have like these whiteboard things and like, okay, yes, this person knows quicksort and how to solve this maze problem. I'm sure that they can build software now. But then we end up with people doing these weird things in organizations where instead of like identifying a communication conflict in the organization, you start like walling off in this little silos and trying to solve it with technical problems. Like, okay, yes, I'm having a problem. I don't know how to communicate with the people in the New York office because of the time zone, or like I don't want to deal with Waffle because he's like so difficult and I don't understand him. I'll just put things in a separate file. I just wrap this in a separate class instead. And you like see like realize it becomes these like weird structures of onions where there's layers and layers and layers on top of each other, and multiple libraries of things and multiple versions of those libraries. Especially multiple versions of those libraries is dreadful, because all the other teams will fall behind in updating their modules. And at Spotify it was like particularly nasty, because Spotify had even went so far as to build micro front ends. And I hear this being talked about like in the industry now, and it's kind of like, that's a bad idea. Like, because when it comes to front ends, you have to be aligned. Like, you want to update. Like when you make a design change, like change the color of your logo, or like your main font or something, or like basically your button color scheme, you want to be able to make that change sweepingly in one fell swoop across the entire application, and probably your entire suite of applications. And if you have like this structure where you have like these separated NPM modules and everybody can be on any version of the NPM modules, then you have a huge problem. And at Spotify, it actually went so far as that you could see it in the client. There was like a part of the client on the window, like one of these iframe applications, that were white while the other were black, because like these were different styles of different eras, and that was only because that part of the application was a separate app that relied on an old version of the styling framework, and due to major changes that were made on top of that styling framework without consulting with the team owning the application, that had fallen behind, and updating it was quite a bit of work. So we couldn't the organization lost its ability to do changes in sync. And I'm not saying that this is only because of antisocial developers or something, but it is a little bit. I feel like that is a little bit part of the problem. Try to solve your communication issues first. Really try to do that. And once you figure out that no, we are really at the end of our communication bandwidth here, then you should do it. But at Spotify, we learned that you definitely over isolated. We kind of created our own little silos, and Spotify made a big change a couple of years ago to go for a lot more alignment between the teams, especially when it came to styling. And I think that kind of led as a consequence to the monorepo idea, when we realized, oh, we have to be able to align changes between teams. We need to be able to make one pull request that spans multiple teams and have the teams bloody talking to each other instead. Instead of making these weird, almost passive-aggressive NPM package updates. And that turned into a huge design improvement in the organization and allowed people to move so much faster. Because earlier, trying a pull request is so good, man. A pull request is such a good work unit. You have no idea until you've tried to work without them. When we had these repos and pull requests and having these decoupling, it was great once you did things that were decoupled. But once you did things that were coupled, it was just a nightmare. We had these horrible spreadsheets that were coordinated between teams and saying we have updated to this version of the styling framework and this NPM model, la 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 la, and it's was just so ugh. And once we moved to a monorepo, this could be tracked in a pull request, and all the things could be done at the same time, and you could test testers could test the entire build at the same time, and teams could go in and say, you need to fix this thing and this thing and everybody could collaborate in a good way. That was so good. Just the fact that you get the ability to pull requests across things. So even if you divide your thing into NPM modules, I still think it's a good idea to keep them all in one big repo, because then you can make the changes and version updates sweepingly as well. Yeah. Well, that's a long rant, and also to be clear, I no longer work for Spotify, so I have no idea what's going on in there. This is just my learnings from my period there, and I've also seen this in other software contexts and hear it all over. So, rooftop duvet. It is an excellent question. I'm not trying to put you down here. I think a lot of other people feel the same. But if your developers don't have the awareness to properly inspect code changes and what the changes is going to affect, if you're lacking the test pipelines to verify that, if you haven't instilled a sense of group ownership in your employees effectively, or if you don't have good build tools in place, those 4 things are the problems that you need to solve. Your problem is not that your code is not modularized or separated out enough. That will just make the problem worse if you do it. Try to solve these things first. And it starts by talking. Talking is great, having meetings is great, coordinating your efforts is great, and pair programming is great. Try to get the collaboration going. Onwards together. Those are some quick thoughts this Friday. I hope you enjoyed this extra little video. And I will see you on Monday. Don't miss the live stream. Bye.